In July 2021, South Africa faced one of its darkest weeks in recent memory. Riots erupted. Shopping centers were looted. Cities across KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng descended into chaos. The unrest began as a political protest, but it quickly spiraled out of control. While the country burned, one suburb near Durban made headlines for a different reason. In Phoenix, a community erected roadblocks to protect itself from looters. Armed patrols roamed the streets. Residents claimed they were defending their homes. But what unfolded was not just self-defense. It was something far more disturbing. By the time the dust settled, more than 30 people, mostly black South Africans from neighboring townships, were dead. Shot, beaten, and some burned beyond recognition. Many were unarmed. Some were simply trying to get home. Others were never seen alive again. The country watched in shock as Phoenix became a symbol of a deeper crisis. A place where fear turned neighbors into vigilantes. A place where race, rage, and misinformation collided with deadly consequences. Who were the real perpetrators? Was this coordinated violence or chaotic fear? Why were some security companies implicated? And why, years later, have so few answers come to light? This documentary investigates the Phoenix gang killings. A case that raised uncomfortable questions about justice, race, and who we become when law and order collapse. This is the story of what happened in Phoenix. And why South Africa cannot afford to forget it. The spark that ignited the flame. In early July 2021, South Africa found itself on the edge of an unprecedented national crisis. The imprisonment of former President Jacob Zuma, once a liberation hero and still a figure of immense political influence, set off a chain of events that would ultimately expose the country's unresolved tensions, its fragile governance structures, and the dark undercurrent of racial division. Zuma's arrest on July 7, 2021, was met with immediate outrage in KwaZulu-Natal, his home province. Supporters flooded the streets, protesting what they viewed as a politically motivated judicial attack. But those protests quickly mutated into something far more chaotic. By July 9, the unrest had spread like wildfire across the province and into Gauteng. What began as political dissent turned into rampant looting, arson, and targeted destruction of infrastructure. Shopping malls were stripped bare. Trucks were burned on highways. Warehouses were looted and set alight. The police, overwhelmed and under-resourced, failed to contain the violence. Durban, the third largest city in the country, became one of the epicenters of the mayhem. And it was just north of this urban sprawl, in the suburb of Phoenix, where the violence would take an especially deadly and disturbing turn. Phoenix is a historically Indian area that dates back to Apartheid-era group areas policies. Separated from neighboring black townships such as Inanda and KwaMashu by only a few kilometers, Phoenix had for decades been seen as a relatively stable, middle-income community with a strong sense of self-policing and tight-knit neighborhoods. But that perceived stability would be tested to its limits during the July unrest. As chaos consumed nearby areas, panic began to take hold in Phoenix. WhatsApp groups lit up with alarming messages, some real, many exaggerated or entirely false. Stories spread of mobs planning to invade the suburb, of armed gangs coming to loot homes, and of trucks filled with weapons and looters heading toward Indian neighborhoods. Fear morphed into paranoia. Paranoia evolved into preemptive aggression. With police largely absent and emergency services overwhelmed, residents took matters into their own hands. Makeshift roadblocks sprang up overnight at the entrances to Phoenix. Some were simple, car tires and rubbish bins. Others were more organized, complete with armed civilians, some donning bulletproof vests, patrolling the area in bakkies and SUVs. Initially, these checkpoints were presented as community protection initiatives. But very quickly, the line between defense and vigilantism disappeared. In the confusion and lawlessness, many of those stopped at the roadblocks were black South Africans from the adjacent townships. Some merely passing through, some headed to work, some seeking food, and others trying to return home amid transport shutdowns. What happened next was grim. Eyewitness reports and later investigations would reveal a pattern. Individuals were pulled from vehicles, interrogated, beaten, and in some cases shot. Others were chased down on foot, assaulted, and left for dead. There were instances where people were tortured. Some stabbed repeatedly, others set alight. In many of these cases, no weapons or looted goods were found on the victims. By the time authorities regained control, over 30 people had been killed in Phoenix. The overwhelming majority were black men. The violence, widely described in the media and by human rights observers as racially motivated, sent shockwaves across the nation. The community of Phoenix, once known for its resilience and tight-knit values, was now being mentioned in the same breath as massacre, racism, and murder. This was no longer a case of defending homes from looters. It had become something else entirely, a breakdown in law, in humanity, and in the ability of South Africans to trust one another across racial lines. The story of the Phoenix gang killings was not just about fear. It was about how quickly fear, when fed by misinformation and left unchecked by law enforcement, can turn ordinary people into executioners. And it would only get worse from here. The victims and their stories. When the fires were extinguished and the streets of Phoenix quieted, what remained was more than just the shell of a scorched community. What remained was grief. Raw, unrelenting grief. Dozens of families across KwaZulu-Natal, many from the neighboring townships of Inanda, Ntuzuma and KwaMashu, were left to mourn sons, brothers, fathers and friends who never made it home. By mid-July, the body count in Phoenix had climbed to 36 confirmed deaths. The overwhelming majority of the victims were young black men. Many were shot. Others were beaten to death. Several were burned beyond recognition. Each of these victims had a name, a face, a life cut short in a moment of unimaginable violence. Sandile Kaluza, the bright student. Sandile Kaluza was just 18 years old. A bright and promising student, he lived with his parents in Inanda. He was not a looter, nor was he armed. According to his family, Sandile had gone out on July 12 to check on relatives and never returned. 3 days later, his body was found dumped at the edge of Phoenix, riddled with stab wounds and gunshots. His face was bruised beyond recognition. The only way his family could identify him was by a scar on his leg and the shoes he wore. His father, Wonderboy Kaluza, later told the press that Sandile was a respectful, God-fearing child who loved school and his church. He broke down during a community memorial service, holding his son's photo while calling for justice. "They say he was a criminal," he said through tears. "My son was not a criminal. My son was a child. He was murdered for being black." Mpilo Mthalane, the devoted father. Mpilo Mthalane, age 34, left behind a young son who still asks when his father is coming home. On July 9, he went to visit friends in Phoenix and was reportedly stopped at a roadblock. He was shot and rushed to the hospital, but he succumbed to his injuries on July 12, the same day the Phoenix violence peaked. Mpilo's family said he was a loving father and a peaceful man. He worked odd jobs and was well known in the community for helping elders with groceries and errands. His death was one of many that initially went unreported, only coming to light after local residents documented the attacks on social media and passed photos to journalists. The missing and the misinformed. Several victims were initially listed as missing. Families searched hospitals, morgues, and police stations. Some bodies were found in open fields or near ditches. Others were burned inside vehicles. One woman, Nalathando Zulu, spent over a week searching for her brother, who had gone out during the unrest to try to buy baby formula. He was found dead 6 days later, his body badly decomposed and dumped near a burned-out vehicle. The trauma of seeing his remains haunted her. Many of the deceased were painted by some community members as looters or criminals. But official investigations later revealed that several of the victims were essential workers, passers-by, or simply people trying to navigate a city in crisis. Others had no connection to the unrest at all. They were targeted because they were black and driving near or through Phoenix. Mass violence in numbers. The official post-mortem report compiled by law enforcement and the South African Human Rights Commission revealed grim details. 36 people dead in Phoenix alone. 33 were black South Africans. At least 20 died from gunshot wounds. Several bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma and torture. A number of victims were set alight after being killed, possibly in attempts to destroy evidence. Witnesses described vehicles being stopped and searched by armed civilians. If the passengers were black and did not have a valid reason to be in Phoenix, they were pulled out, interrogated, and often attacked. Videos and photos taken at the time show bodies lying in the streets, some with hands tied behind their backs. A mother's grief. Perhaps one of the most powerful images to come out of the tragedy was that of Mawandle Ndlovu, an elderly mother who collapsed outside a Durban morgue upon hearing that her 22-year-old son had been found dead. He had last spoken to her the night before his disappearance, telling her not to worry, that he'd be home soon. He never made it. Mawandle's wails outside the state mortuary were captured by journalists and broadcast nationwide. She sobbed. "They killed my boy like he was nothing. They didn't ask his name. They didn't care who he was. They just saw his skin." Her voice, like those of dozens of other mothers, became a rallying cry for justice. The human cost beyond numbers. Each death in Phoenix was more than a statistic. It was a person. A family destroyed. A community left traumatized. The ripple effects extended far beyond those who died. Survivors of attacks reported lasting psychological trauma. Many spoke of nightmares, anxiety, and fear of traveling through certain suburbs. Children lost parents. Wives lost husbands. Communities lost faith in each other. Local psychologists working with trauma victims reported high rates of PTSD among survivors and family members. Schools in Inanda and Tuzuma held special sessions for students who lost relatives. Churches organized candlelight vigils, while others hosted memorials attended by both Indian and Black South Africans in attempts at reconciliation. Unanswered questions. The victims' families wanted more than just condolences. They wanted the truth. Why were these men stopped? Who gave the orders to shoot? Why were some community members allowed to carry firearms and conduct searches without police oversight? Why did so many people die while law enforcement remained largely absent? Perhaps the most painful question of all was this: would these deaths have occurred if the victims were not black? That question continues to hang over Phoenix like a shadow, unanswered, haunting. The perpetrators, vigilantes or murderers? In the aftermath of the killings, South Africa was forced to confront an unsettling question. Who were the men behind the violence in Phoenix? The truth was not as simple as headlines suggested. These were not uniformed police officers or members of a paramilitary organization. They were neighbors, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, security guards. In many cases, they were local men who had lived in Phoenix for years. Men who had grown up in these neighborhoods, sent their children to school here, and prayed in the temples and churches on the same streets where blood would eventually flow. But during those terrifying days of unrest, something changed. These ordinary men transformed into self-appointed guardians, armed civilians who believed it was their duty to protect their community. In their minds, they were defending Phoenix. In reality, many became judge, jury, and executioner. Roadblocks and racial profiling. As the unrest in Durban intensified, Phoenix residents, motivated by fear and bombarded with unverified messages on social media, began organizing community patrols. These groups erected checkpoints at entrances to the suburb. What began as informal watchpoints quickly morphed into militarized barricades. Some of these checkpoints were coordinated by neighborhood WhatsApp groups, often populated by local businessmen, security company owners, and former military personnel. Guns were handed out. Homemade spike strips were laid on roads. Residents were told to shoot to kill, if threatened. But very soon the checkpoints stopped being about safety. They became traps. Witnesses and survivors recounted a disturbing pattern. Any vehicle carrying black passengers, especially young black men, was stopped, searched, and often attacked without provocation. In some instances, people were accused of looting based solely on the color of their skin or the direction they were driving from. Multiple victims were found with no stolen items or weapons in their possession. One survivor, 27-year-old Thabo Dlamini, described being pulled from a car and beaten unconscious for simply driving through the wrong road at the wrong time. He was left for dead in a ditch, his skull fractured, his ribs broken. "I thought I was going to die there," he later said. "They didn't care who I was. They just saw a black man and assumed I was the enemy." Who were the killers? As the dust settled, the South African Police Service, SAPS, and the Hawks, Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation, began identifying key suspects behind the violence. What they discovered was a patchwork network of community members who took the law into their own hands. Among those arrested were the security guards working for private companies operating in Phoenix, taxi drivers and rank marshals known for running the Phoenix-Inanda route, local business owners who allegedly supplied firearms and coordinated roadblock patrols, civilians with no criminal record who joined defense groups out of fear, but later escalated to violence. Some suspects had ties to local crime groups, including alleged involvement in protection rackets and extortion. Investigators suspected that the unrest gave these individuals cover to settle scores or exert power over their communities. The arrests that followed included men like Melvin Govender, a 45-year-old security contractor accused of firing an unlicensed rifle into a crowd of unarmed people. Rajesh Hariprasad, a local shop owner who reportedly handed out firearms from the back of his hardware store and gave instructions via group chats on who to detain at checkpoints. Ruben Naidu, a 24-year-old man seen in multiple cell phone videos dragging victims from their cars and stomping on them as others joined in. In total, over 56 suspects were arrested in connection with the Phoenix killings. Charges included murder, attempted murder, illegal possession of firearms, assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm, and incitement to violence. A culture of impunity? What shocked investigators wasn't just the brutality of the attacks, it was how organized some of them were. Footage emerged of armed convoys patrolling Phoenix streets, flashing lights, and using two-way radios to coordinate. Some roadblocks even had command centers, where residents gathered to receive instructions on suspected threats. What made matters worse was the near-total absence of law enforcement during the height of the violence. SAPS admitted to being overwhelmed. In some cases, police allegedly stood by while attacks took place, claiming they were outnumbered and underarmed. This vacuum of power gave the perpetrators the confidence to act without consequence. And perhaps the most disturbing element of all, some residents celebrated the killings. Social media lit up with posts congratulating Phoenix soldiers for cleaning up the streets and protecting our town. To many outside observers, it appeared that a line had been crossed. This wasn't community defense. This was racialized mob justice. The Phoenix gang narrative. As media attention intensified, a new phrase began to dominate headlines: the Phoenix gang. This term didn't refer to a single organized group, but rather a collective label for the multiple armed patrol units operating in the suburb. Each roadblock had its own enforcers. Some wore balaclavas. Others filmed their actions, boasting about stopping the looters. The South African Human Rights Commission later revealed that several of these groups operated with military-style coordination, and that at least one had access to automatic weapons. The killings, the commission concluded, were not spontaneous acts of fear, but part of a broader pattern of racially motivated vigilantism. Not everyone participated. It is crucial to note, not every resident of Phoenix took part in the violence. Some tried to stop it. There were Indian South Africans who sheltered black families in their homes. Others smuggled injured victims out of the suburb under cover of night. A few brave community leaders openly condemned the attacks, even as they faced backlash from neighbors. One woman, Kamala Naidu, told a local radio station, "What happened here shamed us all. That wasn't defense. That was murder. And the community must take responsibility." Her voice, though in the minority at first, grew louder over time as calls for justice swept through Durban and beyond. A divided community. The perpetrators of the Phoenix killings were not only arrested, they were unmasked. As photos circulated of handcuffed suspects, some bloodied, some defiant, it became clear that this was not a tale of heroes protecting their homes. It was a story of people who, in a moment of national chaos, allowed their fear and prejudice to justify murder. And behind them, a community stood fractured. Some cheered their arrest. Others wept for the reputational damage inflicted on Phoenix. And many remained silent, afraid to choose a side in a suburb now known not for peace, but for bloodshed. The question now wasn't just who committed the crimes. It was why they felt justified in doing so. Justice on trial, the legal aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of the Phoenix killings, grief turned to outrage, and outrage to demands for accountability. The families of the dead cried out for justice. Civil society mobilized. Politicians called for arrests. And slowly, under intense national pressure, the machinery of South Africa's justice system began to grind into motion. But as the legal proceedings unfolded, so too did the cracks in the system. For many South Africans, especially the victims' families, justice remained painfully elusive. A wave of arrests. Between July and October 2021, over 56 suspects were arrested in connection with the Phoenix violence. These included business owners accused of supplying weapons or harboring attackers, private security guards, some of whom were caught on CCTV opening fire on civilians, taxi drivers and patrol group members, directly linked to beatings, shootings, and detentions. The charges ranged from murder and attempted murder to assault, arson, and possession of illegal firearms. In some cases, suspects were also charged with incitement to violence via social media. A special team from the South African Police Service, SAPS, and the Hawks launched a targeted operation in Phoenix and surrounding areas. Using CCTV footage, WhatsApp chats, witness statements, and forensic evidence, they began building their cases, each one a painstaking puzzle of time, place, and intent. The courtroom battles begin. The first major case to reach the courts involved 3 men charged with the murder of Monli Majola, a 19-year-old killed on July 12, 2021. The suspects, Dylan Govender, Niven Madho, and Jonathan Naidu, were accused of fatally assaulting Majola after he was allegedly found near a warehouse during the unrest. According to witness accounts, Majola was unarmed and trying to flee. The case captured national attention. It marked the beginning of what many hoped would be a wave of successful prosecutions. During the trial, the state presented surveillance footage showing the three men attacking Majola with sticks and metal rods. Forensic experts confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. The defense argued that the men acted out of fear, believing Majola was a looter. The courtroom was tense throughout. Majola's family sat silently during proceedings, their faces etched with grief. When the Durban High Court eventually convicted the men of murder, a ripple of subdued applause broke out in the gallery. But outside the courtroom, emotions ran hotter. Some Phoenix residents gathered in support of the accused, claiming they were protectors, not killers. Others denounced the verdict as too little, too late. Other trials and delays. Despite the early convictions, progress stalled in dozens of other cases. Many suspects were granted bail. Court dockets went missing. Witnesses pulled out. In several cases, the state struggled to gather sufficient evidence due to a lack of CCTV footage or uncooperative local witnesses. By mid-2022, only a handful of trials had concluded. Frustration mounted. Civil society organizations like Abalali Basinjandalo and Equal Education demanded an independent inquiry into the slow pace of justice, claiming that police had failed to treat the Phoenix killings with the urgency they deserved. The National Prosecuting Authority, NPA, responded by promising more resources and the appointment of a dedicated Phoenix Crimes Task Team. Still, the wheels of justice moved slowly. The Human Rights Commission inquiry. While the courts ground forward, a parallel process emerged. The South African Human Rights Commission, SHRC, launched a formal inquiry into the Phoenix violence. Over 3 weeks of televised hearings, the commission heard from victims' families, eyewitnesses, police officers, community leaders, security company executives, politicians from all sides. The testimonies were harrowing. One woman described watching her son get dragged out of his car and shot in the head at point-blank range. Another man spoke of being tied up, beaten, and left for dead while his cries echoed through an empty street. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of SAP's members, who admitted under oath that they were unprepared, under-resourced, and afraid to intervene. The SARC's final report was scathing. It concluded that the violence in Phoenix was racially motivated. Armed groups operated with impunity. Law enforcement failed to prevent or stop the killings. Some killings constituted hate crimes under South African law. The report called for urgent criminal accountability, police reform, and restorative justice efforts in the community. Civil society steps in. As frustration with the state response grew, civil society organizations and human rights lawyers stepped into the vacuum. Groups like the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, SERI, and Legal Aid South Africa offered free legal representation to victims' families. Others launched public campaigns, holding vigils, creating memorial murals, and documenting the names of the dead. These efforts put additional pressure on prosecutors and politicians alike. In the townships of Inanda, KwaMashu, and Tuzama, grassroots movements began demanding racial justice, police accountability, and economic equality, arguing that the Phoenix killings were a symptom of deeper, unhealed wounds in South African society. Political fallout. Politicians from every major party weighed in. The ANC called the killings barbaric and urged swift arrests. The EFF went further, calling them ethnic cleansing and marching through Phoenix in protest. The DA, while condemning the violence, warned against racial generalizations and emphasized the breakdown of law enforcement. Minister of Police Becky Seal visited Phoenix and famously declared, "People were killed based on the color of their skin. This was not just about looting. This was murder." His remarks inflamed tensions but underscored the severity of the events. A slow road to justice. By early 2023, over 30 suspects were still awaiting trial. Many families of victims had grown disillusioned. The long waits, the legal jargon, the delays. For them, justice was not only slow, it was painful. Reopening wounds every time a court date was pushed back. Every time a bail application was granted. Still, there were small victories. Each conviction represented a step, however small, toward accountability, toward closure. But justice in this case was not just about locking up killers. It was about confronting a system that allowed it to happen in the first place. A nation divided, race, history, and the fault lines of violence. The Phoenix killings were not merely the result of spontaneous vigilantism or fear run amok. They were the consequence of a deeper, more dangerous undercurrent in South African society, a legacy of racial division that never truly healed after apartheid. The suburb of Phoenix became the stage, but the script had been written long ago, by segregation, inequality, mistrust, and silence. The violence didn't erupt in a vacuum. It was born from the unresolved tension between Black African and Indian communities, living side by side in a country that often treats reconciliation as a checkbox instead of a process. A painful history. Phoenix, a historically Indian suburb established during apartheid under the Group Areas Act, sits just kilometers from the Black African townships of Inanda, KwaMashu, and Ntuzuma. Though physically close, these communities have long lived separate lives, socially, economically, and emotionally. During apartheid, the government enforced spatial and racial segregation. Indian South Africans were placed in areas like Phoenix, while Black South Africans were pushed into underdeveloped townships with poor infrastructure and minimal services. Post-1994, democracy brought legal equality, but the economic gap between communities persisted. Phoenix retained relative stability. Many of its residents owned businesses, had access to formal employment, and lived in brick houses with water and electricity. Just a few streets away, informal settlements in Inanda battled poverty, high unemployment, and crime. This disparity bred tension. And over time, that tension calcified into suspicion and resentment. While many individuals crossed racial lines in friendship, business, and community initiatives, the collective consciousness remained fractured, shaped by past injustice, media stereotypes, and political scapegoating. Stereotypes and mutual mistrust. The unrest of July 2021 became the spark that ignited long-held resentments. Many Phoenix residents, fueled by fears of looting and viral videos of burning malls, viewed Black African protesters as invaders, intent on destroying their community. In turn, many Black South Africans saw the armed Phoenix patrols as racist gangs, eager to kill under the guise of defense. Social media inflamed this division. Messages spread warning Indian families to arm themselves, while others falsely claimed that mobs from Inanda were coming to burn Phoenix. The old stereotypes resurfaced. That Indians looked down on Black people. That Black South Africans envy Indian success. That both communities are inherently separate and incompatible. It was these dangerous simplifications that made it easier for a man at a roadblock to see a stranger not as a neighbor, but as a threat. Not as a person but as a target. Leadership failures. Many critics pointed to the failure of leadership, both political and community-based, to prevent the spiral into violence. Where were the ward councillors? The religious leaders? The youth groups? Why were there not immediate efforts to calm tensions, dispel rumors, and protect all civilians regardless of race? Instead, politicians often seemed to exploit the divide. As some Indian leaders defended the patrols uncritically, framing them as heroes. Others downplayed the violence, suggesting the media exaggerated events. Conversely, some Black political voices used the tragedy to generalize Indian South Africans as racist aggressors, painting an entire community with one bloody brush. This lack of nuance deepened the chasm. Rather than using the tragedy to unite communities in grief, many used it to score political points. The consequences of division. The long-term impact of the Phoenix killings went beyond courtrooms and funerals. It affected how South Africans saw each other, and themselves. In Phoenix, a once proud community now found itself associated with vigilante murder. In Inanda, people spoke of Phoenix as enemy territory, and warned their children to avoid it. Across the country, interracial friendships became strained. Conversations grew cautious. Even 2 years after the killings, community healing remained fragile. Some initiatives emerged. Interfaith prayer gatherings between Black and Indian congregations. School exchange programs for learners from Phoenix and Inanda. Community dialogues facilitated by NGOs. But these efforts were small and often met with skepticism. True healing would require more than handshakes and press statements. It would require acknowledging the pain, listening to each other, and committing to structural change, in housing, policing, education, and economic opportunity. Has South Africa learned anything? The Phoenix killings were a wake-up call. But has the country truly answered it? On paper, the answer is mixed. Some convictions were secured, and the Human Rights Commission produced a damning report. The SAPs launched reforms, promising better coordination in future unrest. The community programs were funded to promote unity. Yet many of the underlying conditions remain. A deep racial mistrust. segregated neighborhoods, economic inequality along racial lines, a weak and under-resourced police force. South Africa remains a country where proximity does not mean unity, where two communities can live across the street from one another and still remain worlds apart. The victim's legacy. Amid the political noise, one truth remains constant. 36 people lost their lives. Most were innocent. Many were young. All were South Africans. Their families continue to grieve. Their names are etched not just on tombstones, but in the memory of a country struggling to reconcile its democratic ideals with the reality on the ground. If their deaths are to mean anything, South Africa must do more than prosecute a few individuals. It must confront its divisions, its history, and its habits of silence. Only then can we begin to say, never again. Never again, remembering, reckoning, rebuilding. In the months and years following the Phoenix killings, the scars remained, not just in the communities directly affected but across the entire nation. South Africa was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, about the illusions of unity, the persistent
A year after her brother Delani Khumalo was killed, Sizo Khumalo is still inconsolable. The brutal murder of Delani and his cousin Mlondi left deep emotional scars. Two portraits of the Khumalo cousins, both with broad smiles, are prominent in Sizo's living room of her house in G section, KwaMashu. It's a stark reminder of happier times. Delani was an internationally acclaimed choreographer. The family says it's painful to remember the traumatic death of their loved ones a year later.
Delani was our hope. I sometimes fail to express myself because I am still heartbroken. The killers took away our last hope in the family. He was like our parent and our pillar of strength. We were looking up to him.
Of fear and the fragility of peace. Phoenix became more than a name. It became a symbol of what happens when inequality festers, when history is ignored, when race is weaponized, and when justice arrives too slowly, if at all. The long road of grief. For the families who lost loved ones, time did not heal all wounds. Some still walk past the scenes of violence each day, corners, driveways, and streets where their sons and daughters took their last breaths. Others drive long distances to attend court dates, clinging to hope for accountability. The grief of many was compounded by public denial, victim blaming, or the silence of neighbors. For them, true justice was not just about prosecutions but about recognition, about dignity, about being seen. Some families chose to forgive. Others could not. Some stayed. Others moved away, unable to live near the place that took everything from them. Voices of reconciliation. Amid the pain, there were glimpses of hope. In one emotional community event held a year after the killings, a mother from Inanda whose teenage son had been killed in Phoenix stood side by side with an Indian community leader. They lit a candle together. There were no speeches, just silence and tears. At a school in KwaMashu, a teacher organized a mural painted by students, black and Indian, bearing the words, "One South Africa, one people, one future." Local pastors, imams, and activists held listening sessions. There were no easy answers, but the act of sitting together, of listening, was itself revolutionary. Some police officers who had failed to act during the unrest returned to communities not in uniform but in remorse. They spoke of their regret, of how unprepared they were, and how they would never be caught off guard again. These gestures didn't erase the horror, but they were seeds, small and fragile, of something new. The lessons of Phoenix. From this tragedy, South Africa must learn. Lesson 1. Peace is not the absence of violence. It is the presence of justice. Where there is inequality, suspicion grows. Where there is injustice, resistance brews. If we want peace, we must ensure that all citizens, regardless of race or class, are treated fairly by the law. Lesson 2. History matters. The lines drawn under apartheid did not disappear in 1994. They still exist, in housing, education, employment, and even hearts. Until we reckon with our past, we will keep repeating it. Lesson 3. Leadership matters. When chaos erupts, people look to leaders, political, religious, civic, for guidance. Silence is not neutrality. It is permission, and sometimes complicity. Lesson 4. Justice delayed is not just justice denied, it is trauma prolonged. The state must move faster. Courts must function efficiently. Victims must not be left waiting years for answers. And perhaps most importantly, Lesson 5, we are not each other's enemies. The looters did not represent all black South Africans. The vigilantes did not represent all Indian South Africans. When we generalize, we dehumanize. And when we dehumanize, we open the door to violence. The ashes of Phoenix. The word phoenix has always meant more than just a place. In mythology, a phoenix is a bird that dies in flames, and then rises reborn from its own ashes. The suburb of Phoenix burned in 2021. Not in literal fire, but in the fire of violence, hate, fear, and death. But the story doesn't have to end in ashes. It can be a story of rebirth, of reflection, of reckoning, of rising. If South Africa can stare into the mirror of Phoenix and see not them, but ourselves, then perhaps something new can be born. Not just from tragedy but from truth. The 36 lives lost during the Phoenix killings were not statistics. They were children, brothers, mothers, workers, dreamers. Their stories demand more than mourning. They demand a commitment, to do better, to be better, to never let this happen again. This is not just a story of what was lost. It is a warning of what can still be lost, if we do not act. And so, we end not with silence but with a question. Will we rise from the ashes, or will we return to the flames? The answer is still being written by all of us. Thank you for watching. If you found this video enlightening, kindly like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more real South African true crime stories. See you in the next video.